Here I am at Uluru. I'm basically in the centre of Australia. Now, if you ever catch sight of an aerial view of Uluru, you will see that it's in the shape of a heart. So I am in the heart of Australia. Now, this massive sandstone formation behind me, it is one solid piece of rock. Now, you've heard of the saying, it's only the tip of the iceberg. Well, it is believed that Uluru is only the visible tip of a massive underground slab that is connected west out to Katajuda, which is 32 kilometres away. Uluru is naturally grey, but the mineral iron in the rock is rusting at the surface, which gives the outer surface layer of the rock a red-brown rusty colour. The Earth's atmosphere acts as a filter and can remove the blue light from the sun's rays, allowing the redder light to shine through at different times of the day. From orange to glowing red, the vivid colours give spectacular viewing at sunrises and sunsets. The traditional owners of this area, the Angunu, are made up of the Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara clans. As they stand and look out onto this landscape, they see the land formation, the soil, they understand the weather patterns, the seasons, the flora and fauna. They know where the water holes are. They understand and interact with the land in the most personal and intimate way. It has been a source of their being and their living for thousands of years, and it had to be for survival. 25 years ago, this land which I sit on here today was handed back to the Angunu traditional owners because of the great cultural significance it holds for them. Uluru is sacred. It has great spiritual significance. Although climbing Uluru is not prohibited, the traditional owners ask that we respect their law and culture by not climbing the rock. The track that goes up Uluru actually crosses a sacred traditional Dreamtime track. From the millions of footsteps since the 1950s, erosion is changing the face of Uluru. It's a 1.6 kilometre walk to the top and probably about a 2-hour return trip at least. So what happens within that time if you got to go? You can't dig a hole up there, it's solid rock. So if you got to go, you got to go. But when it rains, it washes the mess off the rock and into the water holes below, where the frogs, the reptiles, the birds and the animals live and depend on that water. A study has shown that water quality from rain runoff close to the climb site has a higher level of bacteria than the water holes further away. So you can see why they don't want people climbing Uluru. The Angunu people care for their country like non-Aboriginal people care for their churches. So as a guest on their country, they would prefer that we don't climb it and walk all over it. And I can tell you now, I will never climb Uluru. I will respect the traditional owners of this land and their law and their culture. There were some people in the Bible who thought that Jesus was walking all over and departing from the law of God and the prophets and abolishing the Old Testament and replacing them with these radical teachings. This is precisely what people were beginning to think and say about him. But this is what Jesus said. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. There are many today who think that the law is done away with. They claim that Jesus has cancelled the law and that the gospel removes from us any responsibility to obey it. The great law of love, they say, has replaced all the precise laws and specific requirements of the past. But this belief is the direct opposite of what Jesus stated. Some people today actually think that Jesus had not come to fulfill the law, but to abolish it. Jesus and the gospel he represents doesn't destroy law, but actually fulfills it. The gospel is not opposed to the Old Testament, rather it is complementary. The gospel sets us free from the condemnation of the law, but not from the commands. And you know what? Jesus will give us the power and the desire to fulfill the real meaning of the law and to live holy and pure lives. Paul stated the same truth in these words. Do we then nullify the law by this faith? Not at all. Rather, we uphold the law. The law without the gospel is a dead-end road of legalism. But the gospel without the law is spineless and wishy-washy. The gospel effects is that it fulfills the law in our lives. under the terms of the new covenant, the law is put into our minds and written on our hearts. Let me read Hebrews chapter 8, verse 8 to 10 for you. But God found fault with the people and said, "The time is coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their forefathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they did not remain faithful to my covenant, and I turned away from them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my laws in their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people." What happened under the first covenant was temporary anyway, because the first covenant was inadequate to bring about internal change. It was unable to change a person's heart. The sanctuary services, offerings and ceremonies pointed to something bigger. The earthly sanctuary served excellently as a parable or a shadow, but it was never established to solve the sin problem. Only Jesus would do that. The earthly sanctuary service pointed to Jesus, our high priest, who would obtain our eternal redemption once and for all by his own blood. The blood of bulls and goats were only able to make a person outwardly clean, but the blood of Jesus cleanses our consciences and reaches our inner being. It is by the sacrifice of Jesus that he establishes the new covenant. What is new under the new covenant is that the law will be in our heart and our mind. There are two types of new in the Greek language, neos and kainos. Neos represents something new in time. Kainos refers to something different in quality or kind. Hebrews chapter 8 verse 8 uses the second of those words. It uses kainos, indicating not something new in time, but something having a newness in quality. The covenant is called new because God's everlasting covenant had been completely lost sight of, that it appeared to be an entirely new covenant. But there was nothing new about writing the law in a believer's heart. Deuteronomy and Jeremiah talk about it. Let me read it for you. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 4 to 6. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. These commands that I give you today are to be upon your hearts." And Jeremiah 31 verse 33 says this, "This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. After that time, declares the Lord, I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people." The most important thing is that the law of God is internalized to shape our character and our actions. In both his teachings and his behavior, Jesus fulfilled the law and the prophets. As one who was born under law, he lived perfectly by its guidelines. Immediately after this statement, and through the entire Sermon on the Mount, Jesus filled out the law by unpacking it and showing its real intent and the extent of its claims upon us. And he fulfilled the word of the prophets as the one foreshadowed in the Old Testament types and prophecies. Matthew's gospel is abounding with claims that events in the life of Jesus were fulfillments of prophetic predictions. You know, where he was born, the time he would appear and die for his people, how he would die. It was predicted he would be betrayed and how much he would be sold for. Many, many more prophecies confirm that Jesus was the Messiah. There are over 300 specific prophecies who the Messiah is and what he will do. And Jesus fulfilled every single one of them. Jesus is not a fictional character. Jesus coming down to us is a historical reality that changes our hearts. If there is any question as to the meaning of Christ's statement that he had not come to abolish the law, the next verse should remove all doubt. He says, "I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished." Heaven and earth are still in existence. I'm on Pitjantjatjara and Yankunytjatjara people's land, and the clouds and atmosphere that helped give Uluru its amazing colours are still there too. God's law is as solid as this rock. God's law is still in operation. Both heaven and earth will pass away together. When this earth has given away to the new earth, where we will live in face-to-face harmony with God, the written law of God will no longer be required. The Sermon on the Mount is the law of God in a gospel framework. Jesus' frequently recurrent expression is, "You've heard that it was said long ago, but I tell you." His explanation takes the claims of the law to impossible depths. And apart from the saving and renewing power of the gospel in no way dilutes the strength of the law. It, in fact, for the first time, drives its demands to the very core of our being, addressing not just our outward behaviour, but the thoughts and the motives of the heart, at a level of our wickedness that only His grace can cure. For the Anganu, an essential part of their lives was keeping the law. No Anganu would climb their sacred site. They were not going to trample and walk all over their laws. Well, they could, but they would receive severe punishment for breaking it. Bill Neji from the Gagaju people told this Dreamtime story. You know frillneck lizard? He looked funny. Used to be a good smooth animal. He was man. He done something wrong. Look ugly now. Skinny leg arm. Big one ear. Frillneck. What he done? Break law. In Aboriginal law, there were consequences for breaking the law. We probably won't end up as a frillneck lizard for breaking or disobeying God's commandments. It will be worse. We will miss out on heaven and eternity because of disobedience. God's end-time people are known as keeping the commandments and having faith in Jesus. Let me read it for you in Revelation 12:17. Then the dragon was enraged at the woman and went off to make war against the rest of her offspring, those who obey God's commandments and hold to the testimony of Jesus. Just because someone says the commandments are hard to keep, that doesn't quash God's law. And besides, the Bible says, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. It is by God's Spirit that we obey and keep His commandments. He will give us a new heart and take away the heart of stone. Paul expected Christians to live the law by living under the Spirit. Just as road rules are for our protection and freedom, so is God's law, the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments provide a framework to protect us, to put a hedge around us, and help us live within appropriate boundaries. The law was given as part of God's blessing to His people, in the context of the covenant. The law was intended for our good, to protect us from harm and danger, and to bring us prosperity and life. It was not a means of salvation, but a response to salvation. The motive for keeping the law was gratitude for what God had done for them in bringing them out of Egypt. God has brought us out of slavery and bondage to sin. We keep the law not to be saved, but because we are saved and we love Him. This sign is telling me that the presence of yesterine crocs in this river is a real and present danger. The name of saltwater crocodiles is misleading. Saltwater crocodiles can travel long distances across land and are able to go quite far upriver and live happily in fresh water. Salties are one of the most dangerous of all the crocodile family. Being the biggest and heaviest, they can grow between 4 and 7 meters long. So it's a big possibility that there are man-eaters down there. They are huge, territorial, and aggressive. A croc has immense crushing power in their jaws. My cousin, who was a ranger with Queensland Parks and Wildlife Services in North Queensland, he said the pressure from a crocodile's bite is approximately 1 ton of pressure per square centimetre when it snaps its mouth shut. They can crush skulls and bones, no worries at all. And if they get a hold of you, there's no letting go. In regards to their favourite swimming or fishing spot, some people will say, I haven't seen a croc in this creek for years. When young males mature, they are driven from their territory by larger, more dominant males, and they will move out of a river and head towards the ocean and travel along the shore in search of an undefended area. So a river uninhabited by a crocodile one year could very well become home to a crocodile the next year. Just because you've never seen one, it's not safe to assume that a spot like this does not harbour a resident croc. Because they are submerged and opportunistic creatures, they can strike any time from deep, still or muddy waters where they cannot be seen. I love my life, but I have free choice.
I can jump into this water if I like, but this sign here is for my benefit. So I'm happy to live within the boundaries of safety that this sign is suggesting. On the banks of this river will do me for now. I want to read a few verses for you from Psalms 119. And I'll start in verse 44. I will always obey your law, forever and ever. I will walk about in freedom, for I have sought out your precepts. I will speak of your statutes before kings and will not be put to shame. For I delight in your commands because I love them. Verse 52. I remember your ancient laws, O Lord, and I find comfort in them. 54 to 56 says, your decrees are the theme of my song wherever I lodge. In the night I remember your name, O Lord, and I will keep your law. This has been my practice. I obey your precepts. There is nothing restrictive about obeying the law of God. But to the rebellious or independent spirit, it seems that all God says is, thou shalt not. Many people think that God is a killjoy and that His law and commands are designed to prevent us from enjoying ourselves. But He who made us knows what is best for us. The law of God is like a hedge that protects us, and living within its boundaries actually makes us happier. God's law and commands might be ancient, but they are not out of date. They deal with personal matters and everyday issues. These principles can be our guide and protector wherever we stay or wherever we go. When we obey God's law and put its principles into practice, it's like winning the lottery or finding a garbage bag full of cash. We have been given freedom of choice, and the way to true happiness is found when we choose God's precepts as our guide. When we choose to order our lives in line with God's instructions, we shall receive spiritual riches far greater than winning or finding huge sums of money. The Bible says that God's law is holy, righteous, and good, just like God Himself. One of the Bible writers, the psalmist, reckons that God's way is the best way. Like the psalmist, we can find comfort in these principles and the courage to do what is right. We can experience a deep-seated joy and hope in all situations and circumstances. All these blessings are found on the path of obedience.
Unfortunately, a lot of people have interpreted God's law as a morbid, depressing bunch of rules. I can't do this, I can't do that. But have a look at the principles behind them.
The first 4 commandments tells us whom to worship, God. How to worship, not with idols. Our approach to worship is to respect God's name and not to misuse it. When and why to worship, on the Sabbath day because God is our Creator. The last 6 commandments tells us how to relate to others. The 5th highlights the authority next to God are our parents. We are to honour them. The 6th safeguards life. It forbids murder because life is sacred. The 7th regulates relations between sexes. We are not to be involved in sexual relations outside of marriage. The 8th safeguards property. It forbids stealing. The 9th safeguards reputation. We are not to tell lies about others. And the 10th regulates our thinking. We are not to covet, that is, desire what is not ours, because wrong thinking is the basis of all wrongdoing. The Bible tells us we cannot be accepted by God through observing the law only. The way that we are made right with God is through a relationship with Jesus. The right way to use the law is to expose sin, which leads us to Jesus for His grace and His mercy. And the only motive we keep the law is because we love Jesus. We keep God's commandments and His teaching because we love Him. Even after my horse was broken in, she still needs a bridle. Even after we have been born again, we still need the commandments for a definition of God's will for our lives. In respect to the Anganu people, I would never walk up the sacred side of Uluru. I respect and love God too. By His Spirit and His power, I want to obey Him. And obedience to God is just another way of saying commitment. Obedience is standing up for what you believe in. Obedience is being true to your convictions and being loyal to God and honouring Him. Keeping God's commandments is not legalism, it's called obedience. And obedience brings happiness. When God's commandments are placed in your heart and mind, they become 10 promises. They are no longer restrictions. These wonderful principles give us the ability to become victorious in the spiritual life. The wisest man that ever lived summed up what life is all about. Solomon had more money, more power, more success than anyone that ever lived. When he looked at his life and all that he had done, all that he had accomplished, all the women he had loved, he still came up empty. He had been there, done that, and he was like, now what? He was chasing the wind and he hit rock bottom. And he says in one of my favourite books of the Bible, Ecclesiastes, he says, now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. If the commandments of God are good enough for the wisest man who ever lived, then I think it's pretty good for you and for me.